The horn blast echoes 3 times across the valley, the signal everyone dreaded. From the tower, the watchman screams a single word that will transform 300 lives. Siege! Within minutes, chaos erupts in the bailey. Peasants abandon their fields, driving livestock through the gates. Merchants dump their goods, fleeing for the castle's protection. Children are torn from playing, women from washing, men from their forges and mills. The constable stands at the gate counting heads, making calculations that will determine who lives and who dies. Too many mouths, not enough food. He begins pointing. You stay, you leave. Elderly farmers who've served the Lord for 50 years are turned away. Pregnant women are pushed back into the countryside. Useless mouths, he calls them, condemning them to whatever mercy the approaching army might show. The drawbridge rises with a finality that sounds like a coffin closing. The portcullis crashes down, its iron teeth biting into stone. Outside, the rejected pound on the gates, pleading, cursing, weeping. Inside, those lucky enough to be trapped begin to understand their luck might kill them. This is Rochester Castle, December 1215, and King John's army is 2 days away. For the next 7 weeks, this stone box will become a universe of rationed bread, fetid water, and the constant calculation of how many days until surrender means survival instead of massacre. The real Middle Ages had no chivalry for the besieged, only mathematics. 40 days until honour allowed surrender. 7 weeks of eating leather, drinking blood, and watching your children starve while £20,000 of stone stand between you and enemy steel. This is what survival looked like when castles were humanity's ultimate fortresses, and sieges were chess games played with living pieces. The first hours after the gates closed were controlled panic, orchestrated by men who'd survived this before. Sir William d'Aubigny, Rochester's constable, had held castles against the Scots and French. He knew the choreography of doom. Every mistake in the first day would kill someone in the 5th week. His sergeants moved through the castle like reapers, confiscating food from personal stores. That hidden cheese wheel a merchant thought he'd concealed. Now castle property. The salted pork a knight's family brought, counted and locked in the great tower. Children cried as honey cakes were snatched from their hands, but d'Aubigny knew those tears were better than the skeleton faces he'd see if rationing failed. Every grain of wheat, every strip of dried meat, every drop of oil was catalogued by clerks who understood their ledgers meant life or death. Water came next in the survival hierarchy. Rochester had 3 wells and 2 cisterns, but December meant rain, not snow. The cisterns were only half full. D'Aubigny ordered them sealed except for twice daily distributions. Guards were posted with orders to kill anyone who tried to steal water. It seemed excessive until you'd seen men murder each other over a cup of well water in week 6. The horses presented a cruel calculation. Knights needed their destriers for sorties, but each warhorse drank as much as 5 men. Pack animals and palfreys were marked for slaughter, fresh meat for the first weeks, preserved for later. The knights protested, but d'Aubigny silenced them with simple math. Your horse or your page, choose who drinks. The horses were led to the killing ground, their blood carefully collected. Nothing would be wasted. The castle's population was sorted with brutal efficiency. Fighting men, knights, sergeants, crossbowmen, received full rations. Essential craftsmen, blacksmiths, carpenters, the engineer who understood the mangonels, earned 3/4 portions. Women and children got half rations unless they served crucial roles. The elderly and injured received what theology demanded, but survival discouraged. Enough to die slowly rather than quickly. This hierarchy wasn't cruelty, but mathematics. D'Aubigny had 95 fighting men, 40 support staff, and nearly 200 dependents. His stores could feed them all fully for 2 weeks, or partially for 2 months. King John wasn't known for his mercy. They'd need every day. By nightfall, Rochester Castle had transformed from feudal household to military machine. The Great Hall, where days ago knights had feasted, became a barracks. The chapel doubled as an infirmary. Kitchens were reorganised for mass cooking of thin pottages that stretched grain supplies. Every room was assessed for defence, which windows commanded which approaches, where crossfire could be created, which walls were thick enough to withstand trebuchet stones. Women who'd never held weapons learned to heat sand and water for pouring through murder holes. Children were taught to run ammunition to the walls, Even the elderly had jobs: watching for fire arrows, maintaining the precious water buckets, praying for the souls about to be committed to extremely violent ends. The final preparation was psychological. Daubigny gathered the garrison in the chapel that first night. By flickering torchlight, he laid out the truth sparse as their coming meals. King John had besieged castles before. He didn't accept surrenders until the defenders had felt the stones, until his engines had battered the walls and killed defenders. Surrendering too early meant hanging as cowards. Too late meant massacre when the walls fell. 40 days was the customary period before honourable capitulation, but John respected custom like a wolf respects sheep. They would hold until the walls broke or their bellies did. Anyone who preferred could leave now, through the gates and into John's army. No one moved. They were committed to the mathematics of survival, where each day lasted 24 hours but felt like years, where time was measured in remaining sacks of grain, and the inexorable approach of massive siege engines they could already hear being assembled in the distance. Dawn of day 2 brought the first glimpse of what they faced. John's army spread across the Medway Valley like a dark stain. Thousands of men, hundreds of tents, and worst of all, the siege engines. 4 trebuchets were already under construction, their massive frames rising like gallows. These weren't the crude catapults of earlier centuries, but precision weapons that could hurl 300-pound stones 500 yards. The mathematics of defence suddenly included calculating trajectories and impact points. Daubigny positioned his best crossbowmen to harass the engineers, but at extreme range they could only slow, not stop construction. Each bolt that missed was irreplaceable. Rochester had workshops to make more, but iron was limited, and time more so. The first boulder struck on day 4, smashing into the outer bailey wall with a crack that shook the entire castle. Children screamed, horses reared, veterans just counted. One strike every 10 minutes meant 6 per hour, 140 per day if they worked through the night. Stone walls could take thousands of hits, but each impact weakened mortar, created cracks, turned solid defence into rubble. The bombardment would be constant now, a drumbeat of destruction that frayed nerves as much as walls. Daubigny ordered work parties to shore up damaged sections at night, but trebuchet stones weren't their only worry. Firepots filled with Greek fire splattered liquid flame that water couldn't extinguish. Dead animals launched over the walls spread disease. Most insidious were the presents, hollowed stones filled with messages promising reward for betrayal or descriptions of what happened to captured garrisons. Inside, the siege routine crystallized into patterns that would govern life or death. Water distribution at dawn and dusk became religious ceremonies where every drop was watched. The daily meal, a bowl of pottage that grew thinner each day, was consumed in silence, each person calculating how many more bowls remained. Sanitation became critical, as hundreds of people generated waste in confined spaces. Latrine duty was assigned by rotation, with lime scattered liberally to prevent disease. But lime was also needed for defence. Mixed with water, it became a caustic weapon that burned through armour and flesh. Every resource had multiple uses, multiple demands, never enough supply. The castle's vertical architecture became its salvation and curse. The great tower rose 90 feet, providing unmatched observation and fields of fire. But every bucket of water, every bundle of arrows, every wounded defender had to be carried up narrow spiral stairs designed to exhaust attackers. By week 2, those stairs were slick with blood from minor wounds, sweat from exhaustion, and worse things as dysentery began its inevitable appearance. The upper levels were safest from trebuchets but farthest from supplies. The lower levels had access to stores but caught the full force of bombardment. Families clustered in whatever spaces seemed to balance safety with survival, creating tiny kingdoms of misery within the larger catastrophe. Combat came in waves designed to exhaust defenders. Dawn attacks when guards were changing. Noon assaults when the sun blinded archers on the walls. Night raids to prevent sleep and repair work. Not full assaults. John was too experienced for that. These were probes, testing defences, killing defenders 1 or 2 at a time. A crossbowman leaning out too far caught a bolt in the throat. A sergeant checking damage took a slingstone to the skull. Each death meant redistributing duties, stretching the living thinner. The wounded presented horrible choices. A knight with a shattered arm could still shout orders. Our archer with a belly wound would die slowly, consuming resources while providing nothing. Medieval triage was brutal mathematics. Who could still fight? Who might recover to fight? Who should be made comfortable with careful doses of their dwindling wine supply? By day 15, the first cracks appeared. Not in the walls, but in resolve. A sergeant was caught stealing from the grain stores, packing his family's rations. Daubigny had him hanged from the walls, in view of both garrison and besiegers, a message to both about the price of selfishness. The body swayed for 3 days before a trebuchet stone mercifully smashed it to pieces. Hunger was gnawing now. Not yet starvation, but the constant ache that made tempers short and judgment poor. Children had stopped playing, conserving energy. Pregnant women miscarried from malnutrition. The elderly began dying, not dramatically, but simply failing to wake, their bodies deciding the mathematics no longer worked. Each death meant more rations for the living, a horrible calculus everyone understood but no one acknowledged. Day 20 brought King John's masterstroke. Not an attack, but an offer. Heralds approached under truce banners, reading terms in voices pitched to carry over the walls. Surrender now and the garrison could march out with honours. The civilians would be spared. Daubigny could keep his sword and honour. All they had to do was open the gates. The offer hung in the air like poison. Everyone knew John's reputation for breaking his word, but 3 weeks of siege had taken its toll. The pottage was now mostly water-flavoured with memories of grain. Leather from shoes and belts was being boiled to make a nauseating broth. Cats and dogs had disappeared, then rats, then anything that moved. Daubigny gave no public answer, but that night he reduced rations again. They would need to last at least 40 days to surrender, with any hope of terms being honoured. The castle's social order was crumbling like its walls. Knights who'd never spoken to peasants now shared sleeping spaces with them, all equally cold and hungry. Ladies who'd commanded servants now hauled water and tended wounds. Children of noble blood played with peasant offspring, all equally gaunt. But this levelling had limits. When a knight demanded extra rations for his pregnant wife, Daubigny refused. When the knight persisted, the constable had him flogged. Not fatally, but enough to establish that in siege there was only one law. The knight's wife went into labour that night, perhaps triggered by stress. The baby lived 3 hours. The tiny corpse was wrapped in precious cloth and placed with growing pile of dead awaiting burial that couldn't happen until the siege ended. King John, impatient with conventional siegecraft, tried mining. Sappers began tunnelling under the southeast tower, their work hidden by mantelets, and the constant distraction of trebuchet fire. But Rochester's builders had anticipated this. The castle sat on solid chalk, difficult to excavate. More importantly, Daubigny had his own miners, Welsh specialists who could detect underground vibrations. Countermines were started, desperate races in darkness to intercept John's tunnels. Imagine the nightmare of fighting in spaces 3 feet wide, where you might break through into an enemy tunnel at any moment, where combat was knives and strangling in absolute darkness. One countermine succeeded, breaking into John's tunnel. The fighting was so vicious that both sides sealed the tunnel rather than continue, entombing an unknown number of men who might have lived for days in darkness before suffocating. By day 30, starvation was no longer future threat but present reality. The garrison was eating things that would have revolted them weeks earlier. Leather soaked in urine to soften it. Plaster mixed with the last flour to create a paste that filled bellies while providing no nutrition. There were whispers of worse, a missing corpse from the death pile, children who vanished and weren't asked about. Daubigny maintained discipline through public example. When caught gnawing raw hide meant for armour repair, he ate it publicly, showing that even commanders were reduced to this. But privately, he was calculating endgame. Rochester's walls were holding, but its people were failing. 10 more days to honourable surrender. But would 10 more days leave anyone alive to benefit? The siege's most horrific innovation came on day 35. John's engineers had failed to bring down the walls with conventional methods. The southeast tower, though damaged, still stood. So John tried biological warfare before the term existed. Corpses of siege victims, human and animal, were loaded into trebuchets and flung over walls. The impact was devastating. Not physically, but psychologically. Defenders who'd grown numb to stones and fire arrows broke at the sight of rotting bodies, exploding in their midst. Disease, already present, would now accelerate. Daubigny ordered the corpses burned immediately, using precious fuel needed for warmth and cooking. The smoke mixed with the stench of death and unwashed bodies created a miasma that made breathing difficult. Hell wasn't theoretical for medieval Christians. It was Rochester Castle, in its 5th week of siege. The final phase began with fire and pig fat. John, frustrated by Rochester's resistance, commanded a desperate innovation. 40 pigs, valuable livestock in winter, were slaughtered and their fat rendered. The grease was mixed with combustibles and packed into the mine beneath the southeast tower. When ignited, the fat burned at temperatures that cracked stone and melted mortar. The tower didn't fall immediately. It died slowly over 2 days, stones popping like bones breaking, the whole mass settling with groans that sounded almost human. When it finally collapsed on day 41, the dust cloud was visible for miles. Daubigny stood on the remaining walls, watching their last hope crumble. 40 days had passed. Honour was satisfied. Now came the negotiation between pride and survival. The parley was brief. John, standing in the breach his pigs had created, offered terms that were harsh but not genocidal. The garrison could surrender. Knights would be ransomed. Common soldiers would be spared but pressed into royal service. Civilians would be stripped of possessions but allowed to leave. Daubigny could have fought on. The keep still stood. They might last another week. But another week meant certain massacre, when the last walls fell. He accepted, knowing half measures meant half his people might survive. The gates opened from inside for the first time in 41 days. What emerged barely looked human. Skeletal figures clothed in rags, children with swollen bellies and stick limbs, women aged decades in 6 weeks. John's soldiers, hardened by war, stepped back from the walking corpses Rochester's defenders had become. The aftermath was anticlimactic, as most survival stories are. No heroic last stands, no glorious defiance, just broken people stumbling into winter sunlight. Daubigny surrendered his sword, with hands that shook from malnutrition. Not fear. The wounded were separated, those who might survive were treated. Those too far gone were given quick deaths. It was mercy by medieval standards. Families were split, as men were marched to imprisonment, and women released to fend for themselves. Children clung to both, uncertain which fate was worse. The castle's stores were opened, revealing how close they'd cut it. Perhaps 3 days of half rations remained. Daubigny had calculated almost perfectly, stretching 40 days of food into 41 days of survival. John ordered Rochester repaired immediately, understanding its strategic value. New constables, new garrisons, new supplies flowed in. Within months, it was as if the siege never happened except for the memories burned into survivors' minds. Some of Daubigny's men would be ransomed and fight again. Others disappeared into John's wars, dying in Irish bogs or Welsh mountains. The civilians dispersed into England's winter, begging in villages or finding charity in monasteries. A few left accounts, bitter testimonies about the mathematics of survival, where your child's death meant another day's rations for your neighbour's child. These weren't heroes or villains, just humans reduced to horrible calculations by stone walls and iron wills. Rochester would be besieged again. Castles always were. Each time the lessons would be the same. Ration immediately. Control water fanatically. Maintain discipline absolutely. Except that mathematics, not courage, determined survival. The murder holes would pour their caustic rain. The trebuchets would beat their death rhythm. And inside, people would divide their remaining days by remaining food, knowing that in siege warfare, the only victory was outlasting the equation. Daubigny lived another 20 years, dying peacefully in bed. At his funeral, surviving Rochester defenders gathered. They didn't speak of glory or honour, they spoke of pottage recipes and which leather tasted least awful. They counted, always counting. How many started the siege, how many finished it. The mathematics of survival never left them. These weren't just military installations, but social experiments in extremity. When the gates closed, medieval hierarchy meant nothing if it interfered with survival. Noble blood didn't make your hunger less sharp or your child's death less devastating. The only nobility that mattered was the mathematics of endurance. How much you could suffer without breaking, how much humanity you could sacrifice while remaining human. Modern preppers fantasize about survival scenarios, but Rochester's defenders lived the reality where your neighbour's death improved your odds, and moral choices were luxuries no one could afford. If this glimpse inside a besieged castle fascinated you, subscribe for more unvarnished history. The kind that shows our ancestors not as heroes or villains, but as humans facing impossible choices, with stone walls and iron will. Because understanding how people survived the worst of the past might teach us something about enduring whatever walls we find closing around us.